should be obvious, but if you're wanting to determine your grade at this point, add the grade from your first test to the points from this one divided by 135. And that percentage tells you where you stand. Okay, let's make sure that we're going to start the correct chapter, but I think we're going to start on chapter 4, and we are, which is ethics and research. And I will say that to some extent, well, no, I don't want to say that. Let me just say this. Here we're going to be talking about ethical guidelines that have been approved by the American Psychological Association, and we're primarily going to be focusing on the section dealing with research ethics. Just as a piece of information for the future, for those of you who are planning on going to graduate school, it wouldn't be a bad idea for you to go to the APA website and download a copy of the APA's ethical guidelines, because it will include not just research ethics, but other things related to ethical practice and psychology. Now, if I'm not mistaken, is Dee teaching a course this semester on ethics?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you're probably, how many of you are enrolled in that? Okay, most of you. That's an important class. This section is important because ethics, well, I don't know how, you just really can't understate the importance, or you can't overstate the importance of ethics in, whether it's in research or it's in clinical practice or whatever it may be. I'm not going to be talking much about things that, or you're talking, well, she probably covers research ethics in there. But a lot of the stuff you're talking about in there I won't be covering in here. I'm just going to restrict it to guidelines related to things in the research process. But it is a serious responsibility. It is something that you don't want to underestimate. And if you are conducting research at some point, then you are fully responsible for being knowledgeable about the guidelines that are in place, and you are fully responsible for following those guidelines. And if anybody is assisting you in that research project, or even if you're the one that's assisting someone else, the people that are doing the assisting need to be knowledgeable too, not just the person who's the primary investigator. Because everybody plays an important role in terms of ethics in the research process. Now, it's probably also what I'm thinking about I should mention. In your manuscript, you need to make a statement or statements concerning the fact that your participants or subjects were treated according to APA ethical guidelines. Just explicitly point that out so that the reader is reassured that the guidelines were followed. And that will be in your methods section where you bring that up when you're talking about your participants and your procedures. But the ethical principles, in many ways, are related to what kind of measurement techniques you can use for certain individuals and certain behaviors. They refer to how you select your participants or your subjects for the studies. They talk about which research strategies can be used with certain populations, which research designs may be used with certain populations, how the studies should be carried out, and how the data are analyzed, and how the results are reported. I mean, it covers a pretty broad spectrum. Everything from actually conducting the study to reporting the study. As it points out on page 109 in your textbook, there are two basic categories of ethical responsibility that we want to talk about. The first one is to ensure the welfare and dignity of the individuals, both human and non-human, who participate in your study. And a responsibility to ensure that reports of your research are accurate and honest. So the two broad categories are, how are your participants or subjects treated during the course of the study, and then how do you handle your reports of the study, whether that's via a published article or that's done in a conference presentation. And it's important to point out as well that any facility or any institution, I guess I should say, or agency where research is conducted is required to have what your book refers to as an institutional review board, or an IRB. The institutional review board is responsible for reviewing all research protocols involving human participants before that study is ever conducted. And you have to receive approval from the IRB before you ever begin to conduct that study. There also should be in place at each of these agencies or institutions an institutional animal care and use committee, which has a similar job, but their job is to review any research protocol involving animal subjects. And in both cases, whether it's the Institutional Review Board or it's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, they will provide, oh, well, wait a minute, let me head back to where I really wanted to say. The mission of those two committees is to basically review the proposal to ensure that ethical guidelines are being followed and that the participants or the subjects are going to be treated humanely and ethically. Their mission is not to, and notice I said not, their mission is not to evaluate the study for its scientific merit. Now, if there's something that is obviously bad about the study regarding its scientific merit, then it's certainly worth the committee's pointing that out to the investigator. But their mission is moral and ethical guidelines, not scientific merit. And here at OPSU, both of these are in place. In fact, if you were to submit a proposal for a human study, you would need to submit that to the IRB, and I'm the chair of that committee. That ought to scare the crap out of it. No, it shouldn't. If you submit an animal proposal, I'm on the Animal Care and Use Committee. I've been on that committee everywhere I've ever been. Even when I was a graduate student at OU, I was the first graduate student there to serve on that committee. And largely because the assistant director of the animal care facilities recommended that I serve on it. And that was a very valuable learning experience. So I've actually got more experience with animal care and use than I do with humans. But one thing I'll say is I take research ethics extremely, extremely seriously. If I'm conducting a study, there will not be any violations of research ethics. And if there are, they will be dealt with swiftly, efficiently, and permanently. I don't tolerate any kind of unethical behavior when it comes to research. That's one way to make me extremely, extremely unhappy. Okay. Let's look at some of the things that led up to the establishment of research ethics or ethical guidelines, because these haven't been in place forever. In fact, it was only towards the middle of the 1900s or even later that you began to see ethical guidelines begin to be established. And one of the events that occurred on a worldwide scale, that triggered the establishment of ethical procedures and guidelines was World War II. And a lot of that was due to some of the atrocities carried out by the Nazi regime, many of which were conducted in, quote, the name of science. You ever heard about some of the things that went on during World War II and how they, Kinsley, you think of anything particularly notable?
Well, like, physically, like, they would take twins and would, like, amputate and then, like, switch to see if they would work. Like,
They'd switch what?
they would, like, amputate some part of the body and then switch them to see if they would work. Like, they would take twins and do that, or they'd, like, put people in, like, ice baths for, like, long periods of time and see how their bodies reacted.
Oh, it was ungodly.
Yeah, it's awful.
What was often done. In fact, many of the people who supposedly were in charge of some of these, quote, research projects were hunted down and brought to trial. And in fact, it's the Nuremberg trial and the Nuremberg Code that emerged from all of that really represented the first kind of formalized ethical guidelines for research. And most of the guidelines in the Nuremberg Code are just as relevant today as they were then. And in fact, on page 111 of your textbook, it lists 10 points of the Nuremberg Code. And I want to look at those for just a minute. First, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Now that means you've got to have the mental capacity and the legal capacity to give consent. They have the power to exercise power of choice without any element of coercion, without any kind of duress, without any kind of underhanded way of trying to get people to participate. They need to have sufficient knowledge of the subject matter to make an enlightened decision. Number two, the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other means or methods of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. In other words, it's got to contribute something relevant and something that can be used to improve society in general. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease and other problems under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. I'm going to mention something now that I'll mention again before we're through. When you're looking at conducting a study, one of the things you need to do, in my opinion anyway, is conduct what I call a cost-benefit analysis. Look at the potential cost, both financial or economic and morally and ethically, compared to the potential benefits of the knowledge that can be gained from the study, and be able to show that the benefits outweigh any potential cost. And that's something that I've done every time I've ever conducted a study. Of course, a lot of the studies I've conducted, that really wasn't too much of an issue. It was pretty clear cut. Well, actually, they were all clear cut. It just, in some cases, you might have to spend a little bit more effort going through that analysis. For example, my dissertation involved animal models of anxiety. Well, that implies then that as part of my doctoral dissertation, it involved the induction of anxious states in rats, at least as best we can determine that. Now, I don't particularly enjoy giving a rat an injection of pentyline tetrazole, which is a very anxiogenic drug when administered to humans. But yet, when you think about the role of anxiety in human life, both as a normal emotion and as a pathological condition, it made sense to me that the potential benefits of understanding that phenomenon better and being able to potentially treat it better outweighed some of the costs associated with that research. And when you conduct, number 4, the experiment should be conducted so as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Minimized or eliminated if at all possible. Number 5, no experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. Thought that was kind of interesting. What does a priori mean in so many words? It's a Latin term.
Beforehand?
Yeah, beforehand or ahead of time. What does a posteriori mean? After the fact. Okay, there's your Latin for the day.
What was the second one?
A posteriori, P-O-S-T-E-R-I-O-R-I. Believe it or not, there are times in psychology when a limited knowledge of Latin is valuable to you. Let's try you on this one. If I'm conducting a study with rats, and I say that I'm talking about how they're being housed and fed, and I say that food and water are available ad libitum. It's 2 words, A-D and L-I-B-I-T-U-M, ad libitum. What is that? And it's often abbreviated ad lib. What does that mean? It's available, they can drink and eat as much as they want to. There's another addition to your Latin lesson. Okay. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Proper preparation should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. Now bear in mind, these aren't the same guidelines as APA, but these were guidelines that overlap with APA, and bear in mind the time period during which these were developed. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those that conduct or engage in the experiment. You can't just go out and conduct an experiment just because you want to. You better have the training and the qualifications to do that. Otherwise, you're going to get in a heap of trouble. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if it has reached the physical or mental state where continuation seems to be impossible or undesirable. And then finally, during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. Can you think of a so-called classic experiment in the history of psychology where this would be very appropriate?
Milgram,
And his,
the behavioral study on obedience,
huh?
his obedience study.
Yeah, that one would be one. What would be another one? Another, about that same time period.
The one where they put him in prisons.
Right. The Stanford Prison Experiment that was conducted by whom? I mean, these two studies are cited everywhere. In fact, I think, you know, I just recently came across where they were rehashing some of this stuff, and I really think they received more publicity than they deserve. Now, they were important, and the ramifications were important. I'm not saying that. But I think that for the most part, those things have more or less been resolved by now. But who conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment? Well, part of the reason I'm asking that, well, I'll explain what part of the reason I'm asking that. His name was Philip Zimbardo. And part of the reason I ask that is just to see if that name rings a bell with anybody. Because he was at Stanford, which is a very reputable academic university, for years. And I've never understood how in the hell he got that job and how he's kept that job as long as he did, because the only thing I can think of that brought him any fame or notoriety was the Stanford Prison study. He was more known for his being flamboyant and being almost in the realm of pop psychology as far as I was concerned. There used to be a show on PBS where every Saturday night for 30 minutes he'd come on and talk about important developments in the field of psychology. He had a goatee, a mustache and a goatee, often wore a red cape, and dressed very flamboyantly, acted very flamboyantly, and in my opinion, acted kind of like an idiot too often. But yet, that study he'll be remembered for forever, and he maintained a faculty position at Stanford for a long, long period of time. Okay, so Milgram, which was mentioned there, the Zimbardo would be another one. Just to mention a couple of other things that, you know, in addition to the war that contributed to the need for ethical guidelines, the U.S. government is not free of abuses in human research or in animal research. There have been some notable situations in which it's hard for me to fathom that these things were ever done, but they were. One that your book mentions is the Tuskegee study, involving around around 400 men, and I believe these were all black men, who were suffering, who had syphilis, but were not treated for the syphilis, even though antibiotics were available, because they wanted to study the progression of the disease. There is no way in hell you can justify that. But it happened. Back in the 50s, the U.S. government conducted a number of studies on unsuspecting humans concerning the effects of hallucinogenic drugs. And part of the reason, part of the motivation for that was some plans that they had, at least for a while, to try to expose certain world leaders at the time to these hallucinogenic drugs, to get them showing odd psychotic type behavior and an undermine to, in an attempt to undermine their positions. There have been a lot of situations. There may be even situations that are occurring more recently. I don't know. I can't guarantee there aren't. Let's hope not. But we can't guarantee that. Sometimes I wish there was a way we could know all these different kinds of things, but in other ways, it'd probably scare the crap out of you if you did. Okay, so you have some events like these going on, and then as a result of that, in the late 1960s, the U.S. Surgeon General began to require all institutions that were receiving federal funding for research from the Public Health Services to review proposed research to safeguard human participants. And this was, in '74, they passed the National Research Act. And in 1979, the National Commission published the Belmont Report, Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research. And it summarized the basic ethical principles that had been identified by this National Council on Research Ethics. And I want to point out on page 112, I would commit these three things to memory. Out of the Belmont Report, there were three basic principles. The first was the principle of respect for persons requires that this individual should consent to participate in studies, and those who cannot give their consent, such as children, people with diminished abilities, and prisoners, need to be protected. So the principle of respect. The second one is the principle of beneficence. Do no harm to the participants. Minimize risk and maximize potential benefits. And the third one, the principle of injustice, requires fairness and procedures for selecting participants. So out of the Belmont Report, those three components were central to that particular attempt at establishing research guidelines. Now let's turn a little bit more specifically to the development of APA guidelines. When was the first version of APA guidelines established? What year were they proposed? 73.
That's close.
You were close. So think about that. I mean, to you, that may seem like a long, long time ago. It's really not that long ago. 1973, I would have been sophomore, junior in college. fact, 1973, I would have been attending this well, semi-attending this university right here.
You were a sophomore, junior, what'd you say?
73, 74, I went to school here for 3 semesters, or kind of went to school here for 3 semesters.
Write that down.
Yeah, it won't be a trick
Were we
question on
Could
the
be a bonus
test.
question.
Where did you live?
Where did I live?
I was kidding.
I lived in Texas, well, outside of Texoma. But anyway, may sound like a long time ago, but it's really not. In fact, that tells you that the formal guidelines established by the APA initially are a pretty recent development, especially when you consider the fact that the Committee on Ethics was established in 1952. Why in the hell did it take from 1952 to 1973 for those guidelines to be established? Don't know that I have an answer for that. But as it mentions here in your textbook, it was in the mid-60s with Milgram's obedience study, with Zimbardo's prison study, and some of the other studies from that point, that period of time, that I think that provided a major motivation to say, let's get down to business here and let's get these guidelines set up and enforced. The most recent version was published in 2002. And those are the ones you would find if you were to go to the APA website to look at. In fact, on page 113, it gives you the apa.org.ethics or /ethics/code/index, and it gives you an address if you want to see, pursue that. And you can bet your bottom dollar if you go into a master's program, you will take an advanced course in ethics. Okay. Now, look at page 114 and 115. That is a condensed version of some of the APA ethical guidelines. And you need to look through that pretty closely. And let's just go through and make a few comments about some of those things. One of them is the very first one, no harm. Psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their research participants and to minimize harm where it is foreseeable and unavoidable. When psychologists become aware that research procedures have harmed a participant, they take reasonable steps to minimize the harm. If at all possible, well, actually, before I say that, that would relate to which of the 3 points from the Belmont report? Well, to some extent, respect, but primarily beneficence. Do no harm. But you need to think clearly and carefully about any potential research study and evaluate whether there is any potential harm, a potential risk for harm that might arise from that study. And you might, it's one of those things you need to sit down and think about pretty seriously. And even if it is a relatively minor risk, or it's not something that's not all that big a deal, you don't think about it carefully and be sure that if there is the potential for risk, that your participants are informed of that ahead of time, and that things are in place to deal with that if indeed turns out that maybe some of your participants might experience some harm, some of these concerns in the course of participation. And you need, I mean, as it points out, it says, during and after a psychological study, participants may feel increased anxiety, anger, lower self-esteem, or mild depression, especially in situations in which they feel they have been cheated, tricked, deceived, and insulted. Could you ethically conduct a study where you might actually trick the participants? Maybe. Or deceive them in some way? Maybe. Or even insult them? Potentially. But you'd have to provide justification for that, and the fact that the risk would be minimal. A lot of this is dictated by the nature of your study. But you need to let people know ahead of time what will be done and why it will be done. And then as soon as the study is completed, fill them in on the details. A complete explanation, a complete justification for the research, just so that when they leave, they're fine. They understand, they don't have any problems. So you need to get, and we'll talk about this more in just a minute, informed consent ahead of time, and then you need to debrief them at the end of the study. And actually, if at all possible, let them know what the results of the study were. One of the things that mentioned in this section about doing no harm is the topic of clinical equipoise, which is mentioned on page 116, where clinicians have an ethical responsibility to provide the best possible treatment for their patients. But in situations where you're evaluating, comparing different treatment options, and you're randomly assigning people to the treatment conditions, and you really think that one of the treatment conditions may be inferior to the other treatment conditions, what are you going to do there? Where you're denying some of those patients the best available treatment. What the principle of clinical equipoise points out is that you should compare equally preferred, that only compare equally preferred treatments. And if you think there is some honest uncertainty about which treatment is best, or there is some professional disagreement among people who should know concerning which treatment is best, then it's okay to go ahead and do that. But basically what you want to do is you don't want to just give them something that's absolutely useless, unless you have a control group where no treatment is being used, but yet you inform them ahead of time that they may be a member of that group. And then later, after the study is over, they can have the option of receiving the alternative treatment. Informed consent. Let's talk about that for just a minute. Which is item 6 on there. We'll come back and talk about some of the others as well. But informed consent is very important since we're talking about getting people into studies and people to participate. They need to be given complete information about the research and their roles in it before they have to make a decision about whether they want to participate. They have to voluntarily decide to participate. Now, that's not always easy to do. As your book points out, there are three components of informed consent. One is information. It's kind of hard sometimes to give them complete, exact information ahead of time. Why? Because to some extent, if they know everything, then that can alter the outcome of the study, and you're not going to have valid data. You know, we've talked about blind studies, for example, where people don't know which treatment they're receiving. So in some, but they have to know, you have to let them know that they may be in that kind of a situation. And you don't always tell them why something is done ahead of time. You do that in the debriefing. Because sometimes you may be using a measurement procedure that's really kind of disguised. It really doesn't reflect exactly what you're trying to measure. Or you may be, if they know that one treatment is supposed to produce different behavior than another one, then they may act accordingly. You may be using concealed observations. You may be doing a number of things where if they know too much, then it's going to change their behavior. Understanding, simply telling participants about the research does not necessarily mean that they are informed. They may not be competent enough to understand. Young kids are a great example. Kids with, or people with developmental disabilities are another example. Psychiatric patients. I think schizophrenic patients might always understand why they're, what role they may play in a study. Therefore, you have to have some kind of built-in mechanism where these special populations are protected. Like with children, their parents or legal guardians can be consulted, and you have to have a situation in which you're giving them the information and the opportunity to ask questions. And in voluntary participation, they participate of their own free will. You don't want to coerce them. You don't want to twist their arms. And they get to make a choice, not only as to whether they participate, but also if at some point they want to withdraw from the study, they can do that without fear of harm or repercussions. Look at the table on page 119. The components of an informed consent form. This is something that you would prepare and have them read and sign before they participate. But if you give an overview or what the goals of the study are, why you're conducting the study, who's responsible for conducting the study. You give a description of the procedures involved. You identify any potential risk and inconveniences. You describe any potential benefits. You also include whether there will be any kind of charge for participation, or in some cases, payment for participation. Remember when I was in graduate school, there were a lot of grad students and medical students. When the opportunity came up in a research lab there to go participate in sleep studies so they could get paid to sleep. That wouldn't be a bad way to participate. You also need to mention confidentiality, which we're gonna come back to that in a minute. That any data derived from your participants will be held in confidentiality. It will only be seen by people who have reason to see it. And that every effort will be utilized to assure confidentiality. And if it's sensitive information, then information about how, if needed, that might need to be shared. But confidentiality is critical. Alternative treatments. In an intervention study, alternatives available to the client before and during are identified. Voluntary participation, whether they do or not, and the fact that they can withdraw later. You give them an opportunity to ask questions, a list of people to contact about the study, and then a signature line for them to sign, give their permission and a place for the experimenter to sign. Those are the major components of an informed consent form. Now, do you have to, for your manuscript, do you need an informed consent form? No. But you do need to mention, if it's a human study, that your participants, you know, you went through the procedures, you obtained informed consent and all that kind of stuff. When I would order rats, the first day in the lab, I would sit them down in chairs and talk to them about, here's what we're gonna do. And I would give them forms and ask, you know, I would explain all the things we were gonna do. And I would get their signatures before we proceeded any further. You'd be amazed at some of the questions those rats would ask. Heck, they had it pretty good. Sitting there in a climate-controlled environment, comfortable bedding, water freely available. I did have them on a diet, though. They didn't get all the food they could eat.
You didn't ad-lib their food?
Huh?
You didn't ad-lib their food?
No. I did the first week or two they were in the lab to obtain a baseline weight. And then after that, I reduced their body weights to 85 to 90% of that ad-lib weight. Because I was using operant methods to study drug effects, and they needed to be a little bit hungry. But I guarantee you that these were healthier animals at 85 to 90% of their ad-lib weight than they were if they were getting ad-lib food. They would have been obese. Seriously. They like to eat. Of course, when you're in the lab, I guess, you know, they couldn't kick back and watch Netflix and stuff. They didn't have Facebook, didn't have cell phones. Dang, I was pretty inhumane in how I treated them.
Barbaric.
I tell you. They're probably better off for not having that too. Okay. Those are a couple of important things. Let's, I tell you what, let's stop there for today. We'll pick up with